you make it seem so clear, but uh, all the while to the rest of the world, to Chamberlain, to France, to Britain, to the rest of the world, he's saying he doesn't want that. He's making agreements. Everything you just mentioned, you just went through it so quickly, but those are agreements that were made that he's not going to do that. And he does it over and over. He violates the Treaty of Versailles. He violates every single treaty, but he still is doing the meeting. So maybe can you go through it, the lead up to the war, 1939, September 1st? Like, what are the different agreements? What is the signaling he's doing? And what is he doing secretly in terms of building up the military force?
Yes. So he, part of the Treaty of Versailles, you're allowed a very, very limited armed forces. There's restrictions on naval expansion. There's restrictions on the size of the army. There's restrictions on the weapons you can use. There are you're not allowed an air force. But he starts doing this all clandestinely. There are people in Krupper's got, for example, which is in the Ruhr, a sort of big armaments manufacturer. They are producing tanks elsewhere and parts elsewhere in say the Netherlands, for example, and then shipping them back into Germany. They're doing panzer training exercises actually in the Soviet Union at this time. There's all sorts of things going on. The Luftwaffe is being announced to the world in 1935, but it's obviously been in the process of developing long before that. The Messerschmitt 109 single-engine fighter plane, for example, is created in 1934. So they're doing all these things against it, and the truth is he's just constantly pushing. What can I get away with here? What will and of course, Britain, France, the rest of the world, the rest of the Allies, they're all reeling from the Wall Street crash and the Depression as well. So have they got the stomach for this? Not really, and perhaps actually on reflection, the terms of the Versailles Treaty are a bit harsh anyway. So, maybe we don't need to worry about it. And there's just no political will. There's no political will to kind of fight against what Germany's doing. Then he gets away with it. So he suddenly starts realizing that actually he can push this quite a long way because no one's going to stand up to him, which is why he makes a decision in 1936 to go back into the Rhineland, which has been occupied by French Allied troops. At that point, he just walks in, just goes, do your worst, and no one's going to do anything because there isn't the stomach to do anything.
That was a big step in 1936, remilitarizing the Rhineland. I mean, that's a huge step of like, oh, I don't have to follow anybody's rules, and they're going to do nothing.
And he's looking at his military, and he's also looking at response. So one of the things they do is it's very clever. So they get over the head of the Army of the Air, Armée de l'Air, which is the French Air Force. And they invite him over, and Erhard Milch, who is the second in command of the Luftwaffe, invites him over. So come and see what we're up to. We want to be. You're our European neighbours. We're all friends together. This kind of stuff. Come and see what we've got. And he takes him to this airfield. There's a row of Messerschmitt 109s all lined up, like sort of 50 of them. And the head of the Army of the Air sort of looks at it and goes, "Crikey, that's impressive." And Milk goes, "Well, let me go and take you to another airfield." And they go off the sort of the back route out of the airfield and a long circuitous route in the Mercedes. Meanwhile, all the Messerschmitts take off from that airfield, go and land at the next airfield. Here's another, and they're all the same aircraft. And the commander-in-chief of the Army of the Air goes back to France and goes, "We're never going to be able to beat Germany." So you were alluding to this earlier on. How much is this sort of this chutzpah of this ability to kind of portray the mechanized Moloch? It absolutely cows the enemy. So they're increasing the effectiveness of their armed forces purely by propaganda and by mind games and by talking the talk. And, you look at, we might all think these military parades that the Nazis have look rather silly by today's standards, but you look what that looks like if you're the rest of the world. You're in Britain and you're still reeling from the Depression, and you see the triumph of the will. You see some of that footage, and you see these automatons in their steel helmets, and you see the swastikas, and you see hundreds of thousands of people all lined up and Sieg Heiling and all the rest of it. You're going to think again before you go into war with people like that.
It's also hard to put yourself in in the mind of those leaders now that we have nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons have created this kind of cloak of a kind of safety from mutually assured destruction.
Yes.
You think surely you will not do, 1 million or 2 million soldier army invading another land, right? Just full on gigantic hot war. But at that time, that's a real possibility. You remember World War I. You remember all of that. So, okay, there's a mad guy with a mustache. He's making statements that this land belongs to Germany anyway because it's mostly German populated. So, and like you said, Treaty of Versailles wasn't really fair, and you can start justifying all kinds of things to yourself.
And maybe they got a point about the Danzig corridor. They are mainly Germans, German-speaking people there, and it's disconnected from East Prussia, which is just saying, I sort of get it. Maybe they've got a point. And is Poland really a kind of thriving democracy anyway? Not really. By 1930, late 1930s, it's not. It's to all intents and purposes a dictatorship in Poland at that time. I mean, it's not right that you just go and take someone else's country. Of course, you can't do that. But you can see why in Germany people are thinking they've got a point. You can also see why in France and Britain they're thinking, well, do we really care about the Poles? I mean, is it worth going to war over? But there's kind of bigger things at play by this point. That's the point.
Yeah, but before we get to Poland, there is this meeting, September 1938. So Chamberlain made 3 trips to meet with Hitler.
Yeah.
Which culminated in the Munich conference.
Yeah, on the 30th of September, yeah.
Where was Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and Daladier, Prime Minister of France. They met to discuss essentially Czechoslovakia without any of the government officials of Czechoslovakia participating. And Hitler promised to make no more territorial conquest, and Chamberlain believed him.
He chose to believe him, I think, is the thing. Is the point. So it's very interesting. So Chamberlain gets a very bad press.
Uh-oh.
Well, no, I'm not. No, it's not really. It's. I just think there's too much retrospective view on this,
right.
And that's fine because the whole point of history is you can look back and you can judge decisions that were made at a certain point through the prism of what subsequently happened, which of course the people that are making the decisions at the time can't because they're in that particular moment. So I don't think Chamberlain did trust Hitler, but he wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Britain was not obliged to Czechoslovakia at all. France was. France had signed a treaty with Czechoslovakia in 1924. But Britain had not. So there was no obligation at all for Britain to do this. The only reason why Britain would go to war over Czechoslovakia is because of the threat of Nazism and what the ramifications of not going to war with him. But the problem is that Chamberlain's interesting because in 1935 he was Chancellor of Exchequer, and when they started to sort of think, okay, we really do need to rearm, he was very much in favor of substantially expanding and rehabilitating the Navy, so updating existing battleships and so on, and also developing the Air Force. Mm-hmm. There's not really much argument for having a large army because if you have a large army, you've got to maintain it. Britain is a small place. Where do you put them? You've also got to transport them. That's complicated. You've got to train them. You've got to put them in barracks. You've got to feed them, all this kind of stuff. There's a kind of sort of impracticality about having a large army. Whereas navies are great because you can keep them at sea and they can be, on the water. Air Force is slightly different. Air power is viewed in very much the same way that naval power is viewed. That we're an island nation. We have a global assets, and air power gives us the flexibility that an army doesn't. So he is all for backing the expansion of the army, of the Air Force and the Navy in the 1930s. Then he subsequently becomes Prime Minister and sticks to his guns on that. It is he that enables the Air Force and the Air Ministry to develop the first fully coordinated air defense system anywhere in the world. There is not an air defense system in Poland, nor Norway, nor Denmark, nor the Netherlands, nor Belgium, nor France. There is in Britain. Britain is the only one. And frankly, it pays off big time in the summer of 1940. So you have to give him credit for that. Britain interestingly, is also the world's leading armaments exporter in the 1930s, which is amazing, really, when you think everyone complains about the fact that we weren't rearming enough. Actually, we were. When we had all the infrastructure there and we were expanding that infrastructure dramatically. I say we, I'm only saying that because I'm British. So they were doing that. But in 1938, Britain wasn't ready for war. Now, you can argue that Germany wasn't ready for war either. But Chamberlain was prime minister in a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, where 92% of the population were against going to war in 1938. There is not a single democratic leader in the world that would go against the wishes of 92% of the population. Now, you could say, well, he should have just argued it better and presented his case better and all the rest of it. But at that point, there was no legal obligation to go to the defense of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was another of these new nations that had been created out of 1919 and the Versailles Treaty. Who was to say, we in Britain are able to judge the rights and wrongs of that, how fantastic it would be to go to war with a nation a long way away for people whom we know very little, et cetera, et cetera. I'm paraphrasing his quote. But I'm not saying it was the right decision. I'm just saying I can see why in September 1938, he is prepared to give him the chance. Now, I do think he was a bit naive. And what he also does is this really interesting thing. Is he goes over to Hitler's flat, completely ambushes him, goes to his flat on the afternoon of 30th September and says to Hitler, look, I've drawn up this agreement here. And this is to continue the naval agreement that we've already made. And by signing this, you are saying that Germany and Britain should never go to war with one another. And it goes, yeah, well, whatever, signs it.
Yeah.
Chamberlain comes back, lands at Hendon, waves his little piece of paper, peace in our time and all the rest of it, which obviously comes back to bite him in a very big way. But it's interesting that when Hitler then subsequently goes and moves in, that France and Britain decide in rather the same way that there's been discussion about deciding that large portions of Ukraine should just be handed over to Russia without consulting Ukraine a few weeks ago. It is incredible, I think, that France and Britain and Italy with Germany are deciding that, yes, it's fine for Germany to go in and take the Sudetenland, without really consulting the Czechs. It's a sort of similar kind of scenario, really. And it's equally wrong. But when Germany does then go and take over the whole of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, that's the bottom line. That's the point where Chamberlain goes, okay, I've given him the benefit of the doubt. No more benefits of the doubt. That's it. That is, he's crossed the line. And so you reinforce your agreement with Poland and you do a formal agreement. You go, okay, we will uphold your sovereignty. If you are invaded, we will go to war with you. And that is a ratcheting up of diplomacy and politics in a very, very big way. And it is that decision to make a treaty with the Poles is not heeded by Hitler, but it's heeded by literally every one of his commanders. And it's also heeded by Goering, who is his number two and who is obviously the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and is president of Prussia and all the rest of it, and is the second most senior Nazi. And he's going, this is a catastrophe. This is the last thing we want to be doing, is going to war against Britain and indeed France.